Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dry, desperate, and genuinely apocalyptic world of the American Dust Bowl. Not the sepia-toned historical photograph version. The real one, where the sky turned black at noon, the dust-buried fence posts overnight, and a generation's work blew away. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, the thing about the Dust Bowl that the photographs cannot adequately convey is the sound. Before the sky turns black, before the wall of dust reaches you, before the temperature drops 10 degrees in the minutes, before impact, there is a sound. People who survived it described it as a roar, or a hiss, or a low sustained note, like the whole atmosphere leaning forward, and then the light changes. The sky goes orange at the edges, then brown, then the light disappears entirely, and it is noon, and you cannot see your own hands. That is where we are going tonight. Not the depression statistics, not the policy history, though we will get to those. The specific sensory reality of living on the southern Great Plains in the 1930s, when the land that an entire civilization had bet its future on turned against every person who had been foolish enough to stay. The Great Plains were not supposed to be farmed. That is not a retrospective judgment made with the advantage of ecological knowledge that the settlers lacked. There were people living on the Great Plains for thousands of years before European settlement who understood this perfectly well and had organized their entire civilization around it. The Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Lakota. These were not primitive peoples who had failed to discover agriculture. They were sophisticated societies that had assessed the environment of the plains with centuries of direct experience, and concluded that the semi-arid grassland of the interior continent was best used by following the thing that the grassland supported naturally, which was the buffalo. The Great Plains supported somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison before European arrival, which is a number large enough that the herds were sometimes described by travelers as taking days to pass. Not an hour for noon. Days with the ground shaking and the horizon dark with animals. The grasses that supported the bison had evolved over millions of years to survive drought, wind, fire, and the hooves of enormous herds moving across them. The root systems of native Great Plains grasses extend 3 to 15 feet into the soil. The entire structure of the ecosystem was organized around holding the soil in place under conditions that would strip any shallower root system bare. The bison were gone by 1889. The systematic destruction of the southern herd in the 1870s and the northern herd in the 1880s was deliberate federal policy, prosecuted by professional hunters and supported by the army, explicitly designed to eliminate the resource base of the Plains Indian nations. General Philip Sheridan made the logic explicit in a speech to the Texas legislature in 1875, when he argued against proposals to regulate the buffalo hunt. The hunters were doing more to solve the Plains Indian problem than the army had managed in 30 years of warfare. Without the buffalo, the Plains nations could not feed themselves, could not maintain their nomadic way of life, and would have to enter the reservation system. Sheridan was correct about the mechanism and correct about the outcome. The systematic extermination of 60 million animals to break the economic foundation of the people who depended on them was carried out with industrial efficiency. And by the early 1880s, the herds were effectively gone. What remained on the southern Great Plains was an enormous expanse of native grassland, without the animals that had shaped it for millennia, waiting to find out what the next phase of its history would be. The next phase was the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of public land to any citizen who would live on it for 5 years and improve it. The act was designed for the humid Midwest and the eastern plains, where 160 acres of land and adequate rainfall could produce a viable farm. As settlement moved west into the semi-arid region beyond the 100th meridian, the line that roughly separates the wetter eastern plains from the drier western plains, the 160-acre model began to fail, because 160 acres in a region that received 15 inches of rainfall annually was not a farm. It was an invitation to bankruptcy. The boosters and the railroad companies and the land speculators who wanted to sell land and freight capacity described the Great Plains in terms that would not survive contact with reality. Rain follows the plough was the promotional slogan, implying that cultivation itself would draw moisture from the atmosphere and transform the semi-arid plains into productive farmland. This was not true. It was a real theory advanced by real scientists, who had observed that rainfall seemed to increase in settled areas, misunderstood the causation, and produced a conclusion that the land companies found convenient and that the settlers desperately needed to believe. You are arriving in the Oklahoma Panhandle in 1910. You have been in the United States for 5 years, or 10, or you were born here on the frontier. It does not matter. What matters is that you have staked your family's future on a quarter section of land in a region where the sky is enormous, and the silence at night is something you are still getting used to. The soil under your feet is dark and deep. It smells of something dense and alive when you turn it over. And that smell is the accumulated organic matter of 10,000 years of grass roots and animal waste and the slow chemistry of decomposition. And it is, without your knowing it, the entire basis of what is about to happen to you. You break the sod. The native grass comes up in thick mats with a smell like a cut lawn extended across 40 acres. And underneath is the dark soil that every brochure and every neighbour and every county agent has been telling you will produce wheat enough to pay off your land and your equipment and your seed and your debt and still leave you something to build on. You plant wheat. In a good year, the wheat comes up. In a bad year, you go further into debt and plant again. The First World War changed the calculation when the European breadbasket went to war with itself in 1914, and the agricultural exports of France and Ukraine and Germany stopped flowing to the global market. The price of American wheat climbed from around 80 cents a bushel to over $2. $2 a bushel on 160 acres of good wheat land was real money. The federal government actively encouraged Great Plains farmers to expand production. The patriotic slogan was, "Wheat will win the war." The result was one of the largest land conversion projects in human history. Between 1914 and 1930, more than 30 million acres of native Great Plains grassland were ploughed under and planted with wheat across a region stretching from the Texas Panhandle north, through Oklahoma and Kansas, into Colorado, Nebraska, and South Dakota. 30 million acres of the root system that had held the soil in place through 10,000 years of drought and wind and fire, destroyed in 16 years by men with steel ploughs and gasoline tractors, because wheat was $2 a bushel, and the land was cheap, and the future was available on credit, which sounds like a manageable agricultural policy decision, until you realize it was the setup for the greatest ecological disaster in American history. The 1920s wheat boom continued. The war ended, the prices fell somewhat, but the mechanization of wheat farming with large gasoline powered tractors meant that a single farmer could plant far more acres than had previously been possible, and planting more acres was the standard response to falling prices. If wheat is worth less per bushel, grow more bushels. The suitcase farmers appeared, investors from Kansas City and Denver and Chicago, who had no intention of living on the land, who bought or leased acreage on the southern plains, hired local labor to plant and harvest, and collected the proceeds from a distance. The next year country psychology that had always characterized plains farming intensified. Next year the rains would come. Next year the prices would recover. Next year the debt would be manageable. The land itself was being mined. The accumulated fertility of the deep native soil was being extracted year by year as cash crops without being replenished. And the soil structure that had taken millennia to develop was being broken down by cultivation into fine loose particles that would, under the right conditions, move. The right conditions arrived in 1930. The drought that began in the southern plains in 1930 and deepened through 1931 and 1932 and 1933 was not unprecedented. The historical record shows recurring severe droughts across the Great Plains at intervals of roughly 20 to 50 years. But the previous droughts had struck a landscape covered with native grasses, whose deep root systems held the soil through dry years, and the grasses browned and died back in drought, and recovered when the rains returned, because their root systems remained alive underground. The 1930 drought struck a landscape where 30 million acres of those grasses had been replaced with wheat, and where the wheat, a shallow-rooted annual crop, had been harvested, leaving bare soil through the winter, and where the bare soil lay exposed to the wind, and where the wind on the Great Plains blows at an average of 14 miles per h-hour with gusts up to 60, and where the loose dry topsoil lifted from the bare fields and began to move. The first major dust storms of the Dust Bowl period began in 1932. They were not the worst storms, they were the introduction. A dust storm in a region of bare ploughed fields is not a minor weather event. The dust rises into the upper atmosphere and travels with the wind for hundreds or thousands of miles, and the dust from a single storm system can carry millions of tons of topsoil. The early 1930s storms were bad enough to deposit dust on ship decks in the Atlantic Ocean and to darken the skies of Washington, D.C. and New York, with the topsoil of Texas and Oklahoma. The senators and representatives in Washington who received memos about the dust problem in the early 1930s were, by 1934 and 1935, watching the evidence drift past their windows. Congress has very rarely passed conservation legislation for purely scientific reasons. The Dust Bowl produced conservation legislation, partly because the dust arrived in Washington in person. You are inside a farmhouse in the Texas Panhandle in the spring of 1934. The storm warning came 2 hours ago. Someone drove by in a truck and said there was a black wall on the horizon moving fast. You have wet rags stuffed into the window frames and under the door. You have put the children in the bedroom with wet sheets hung over the doorway. You have taken the food off the open shelves and put it in the icebox and covered the icebox with a damp cloth. None of this is sufficient. The dust infiltrates every crack and seam in a wooden structure built before dust infiltration was a design consideration, and a wooden farmhouse has many cracks and seams. When the storm arrives, the light disappears. The temperature drops. You can hear the dust against the windows like a sustained hiss that rises into a roar, and then the pressure in the room changes slightly because the dust is filling the air inside the house, because the house is not sealed against it, because nothing is sealed against it. The dust is 60, 80, 100 microns, smaller than fine sand, fine enough to pass through a window frame, fine enough to fill the air of a closed room until you can see it floating in what little light remains. You hold a cloth over your face. Your children are holding cloths over their faces. The storm lasts 3 hours or 8 hours or 2 days, and when it is over the windowsills, have an inch of fine brown soil on them, and the corners of the room have drifted with dust, and the food in the icebox is gritty, despite the cloth, and you begin, again, to shovel. The shoveling is one of the details that the photographs do not capture. After every major storm, the people who stayed shoveled. They shoveled the drifts from the doorways, so the doors could open. They shoveled the drifts from the fence lines, so the livestock could pass. They shoveled the drifts from the road, so vehicles could move. They shoveled the drifted soil off the roofs of outbuildings before the weight collapsed them, because dry dust weighs approximately 100 pounds per cubic foot, and a drift of 18 inches over a roof of several hundred square feet is a structural hazard. The shoveling was not occasional emergency labour. It was routine maintenance, like feeding the animals or fixing the fences, except that the fence you fixed in the morning might be buried again by the following afternoon. The physical exhaustion of dust storm living, the shoveling, the constant cleaning, the effort of maintaining any standard of domestic life in conditions designed to defeat it, was a form of attrition that wore people down over months and years in ways that do not show up in meteorological records. The static electricity from the dust storms was an additional problem that most historical accounts underemphasize. Dust particles moving rapidly through dry air accumulate static charge, and a major dust storm generated static electrical fields strong enough to short out vehicles. Cars and trucks would stall as the dust cloud engulfed them, their ignition systems overwhelmed by the electrical charge in the air. Farmers learned to drag a chain from the rear of their vehicles to ground the charge, in the same way that modern fuel trucks use grounding cables. People caught outdoors in dust storms were occasionally knocked down by static discharge. Shaking hands with another person after crossing a dust-charged field could produce a visible spark and a shock painful enough to be remembered. The barbed wire fences that crossed the plains acted as large-scale static collectors, and touching a fence during a storm was not advisable. The land itself had become electrically hostile, as if the physical displacement of the soil by wind had acquired a secondary effect designed to discourage any remaining confidence that the environment was manageable. Black Sunday was the 14th of April, 1935. Meteorologically, it was the product of a specific atmospheric configuration. A cold front moving south from Canada collided with warm, dry air over the southern plains, producing winds of up to 60 miles per h, and lifting an enormous mass of topsoil from the bare fields of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas into a wall of dust estimated at 2 miles high and 200 miles wide. It moved south at 50 miles an hour. People who were outside when it appeared described the sky turning black from the horizon, up in a matter of minutes, a wall that looked solid enough to be a physical object rather than a weather event, a darkness that arrived at noon. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in an hour ahead of the storm. Animals ran. Birds flew low and then disappeared. The people who were caught outside could not see their hands in front of their faces. An Associated Press reporter named Robert Geiger was in Boise City, Oklahoma, that day, and the phrase he used in his dispatch, describing the affected region as the Dust Bowl of the continent, became the name by which the entire disaster would be known. The name stuck because it was accurate in a specific way. A bowl is a container with no exit, and the southern plains in the middle of a multi-year drought, with no grass cover and 1 million tons of airborne topsoil, were a container in which the conditions reinforced each other. More bare soil meant more dust, storms meant more soil lost, meant more bare ground. The Dust Bowl was not a single catastrophe with a beginning and an end. It was a self-reinforcing system. Dust pneumonia was what the dust storms did to lungs over time. The fine dust particles that passed through window frames and door seams and wet cloth masks also passed through the upper respiratory tract and into the lungs, where they accumulated in the small air sacs and caused inflammation, scarring, and eventually the progressive loss of respiratory function. Dust pneumonia is not bacterial pneumonia. It is mechanical damage caused by the physical presence of dust particles in the lung tissue, and it does not respond to the antibiotics that treat infectious pneumonia, because there is nothing infectious to kill. The treatment was, essentially, to stop breathing the dust, which was not practical advice for people living on the southern plains in the early 1930s. Children were particularly vulnerable because they were smaller and their respiratory systems less developed, and the cough that parents heard from children after a major storm was the sound of dust in the bronchial tubes. Some children died from it. The parents who watched children struggle to breathe in the days after a major storm, knowing that the next storm would arrive within days, and that there was no certain way to keep the dust out of a child's lungs, were experiencing a specific form of helplessness that is not adequately captured by the general historical category of economic hardship during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was happening simultaneously, and the intersection of the two crises, the ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl and the financial catastrophe of the Depression, produced conditions in the southern plains that were measurably worse than either alone. Farm commodity prices, already collapsing from overproduction in the late 1920s, crashed further after 1929. The machinery that farmers had bought on credit to expand their wheat acreage in the 1920s was still generating debt payments, even when the crops it was supposed to plant and harvest either failed in the drought or produced nothing because the topsoil was gone. The banks that held the mortgages on the land called in the loans. The land that was being foreclosed on was, in many cases, land from which the soil had blown away, land that was now worth less than the debt secured by it. The people who had borrowed money to buy equipment to farm land that was now dust were losing their equipment, their land, and their homes to banks that were themselves failing. The specific financial logic of plains farming in the 1930s had an elegance of total catastrophe that was impressive in its completeness. The question of whether to stay or leave was the defining psychological experience of the Dust Bowl years, and people answered it differently based on temperament, resources, family obligations, and a specific form of stubbornness that is sometimes described as frontier resilience, and that looked, from the outside, a great deal like the inability to recognize a lost cause. Some families left after the first bad year. Some families left after the third. Some families stayed through the entire decade, through storm after storm and crop failure after crop failure, held in place by the debt that leaving would not retire, by the land that was legally theirs even if it was no longer agriculturally viable, by the conviction that next year would be different, by the social fabric of communities where leaving felt like abandonment. The families that left were not failures. The families that stayed were not heroes. They were people making calculations under conditions that offered no good options, and the calculation that looked rational in one season looked catastrophic in the next. The people who left the southern plains in the 1930s became known as Okies, regardless of whether they came from Oklahoma. They came from Texas and Kansas and Colorado as well, and the name became a shorthand for a specific class of displaced agricultural workers moving west along Route 66 toward California, where there was supposedly agricultural work, and the growing season was long, and the climate was mild, and the land was not trying to kill you. The reality of the westward migration was less comfortable than the promise. Route 66 from Oklahoma City to Los Angeles is approximately 2,400 miles, and traveling it in an overloaded car or truck in the mid-1930s with minimal cash and the weight of everything you owned that you had been able to load before you left was an experience that was physically demanding in ways the distance alone does not convey. The cars broke down, the tires failed, the radiators overheated crossing the Mojave Desert. The people in the car were hungry, and the water supply was whatever you had in jugs and whatever you could find at the service stations and small-town gas pumps along the route. And the service station owners and the small-town residents of Arizona and New Mexico and California had been reading in their newspapers that the Okies were coming, and not all of them were pleased about it. California's reception of the Dust Bowl migrants was not a moment of national solidarity. The state of California established checkpoints at the Arizona and Oregon borders in 1936. Technically illegal but operationally effective for several months, where state patrolmen turned back anyone who appeared to be a migrant worker without visible means of support. The bum blockade, as it was called, reflected a calculation that California made in the 1930s and has made repeatedly in different forms since, that the labour of agricultural migrants is economically desirable, but that the social costs of housing, educating, and providing medical care for migrant families are undesirable, and that it would be convenient if the labour arrived without the family attached, which is not how families work. The migrants who got through established camps in the agricultural valleys of the Central Valley and the Imperial Valley, living in conditions that Steinbeck described in The Grapes of Wrath, with an accuracy that the Associated Farmers of California vigorously disputed because it was accurate. The prejudice against Okies in California was specific and social. They were poor, visibly so. They spoke with a regional accent. They had come from somewhere, and they were competing with established Californians for agricultural work at a time when agricultural work was scarce. The prejudice did not require ethnic difference to organize itself. Class and origin were sufficient. John Steinbeck published The Grapes of Wrath in April 1939. Dorothea Lange took the photograph that became known as Migrant Mother in February or March of 1936 in a pea pickers camp in Nipamo, California. A woman named Florence Owens Thompson with two of her children pressed against her, her face expressing a combination of exhaustion, worry, and a specific form of endurance that is the expression of someone who has run out of alternatives but has not yet run out of will. Lange herself said that she drove away from the camp and then turned around because she could not go back. The photograph was published in the San Francisco News in March 1936 and produced a public response that eventually resulted in the federal government sending 20,000 pounds of food to the camp. Florence Owens Thompson, who was 32 years old when the photograph was taken, and who later said she regretted that Lange had taken it because it never helped her and only made her famous for being poor, lived to be 80 and died in California in 1983. The children in the photograph lived longer. The photograph lasted longer than any of them will. Woody Guthrie was from Okama, Oklahoma, and was in Pampa, Texas, during the worst of the Dust Bowl years. He left for California in 1937 and spent the following years writing songs about the people and the landscape and the experience of displacement that constituted one of the most significant documentary folk music projects in American history. So Long It Has Been Good to Know You was written in response to Black Sunday. Dust Bowl Refugee is a description of the migrant experience from the inside that Steinbeck's novel reaches for in a different form. This land is your land, which has become so thoroughly assimilated into the cultural landscape of American patriotic sentiment that it is sometimes sung at patriotic occasions without any awareness of the specific economic critique of private land ownership embedded in its later verses. Was written in New York in 1940 as a response to Irving Berlin's God Bless America, which Guthrie found insufficiently specific about the distribution of America's blessings. The Dust Bowl produced art of lasting quality, which is the thing that catastrophes reliably do. The federal government's response to the Dust Bowl was substantial by the standards of 1930s federal intervention, and it was initiated partly by the appearance of Dust Bowl dust in Washington, D.C., and partly by the political calculation of the Roosevelt administration that the agricultural crisis of the Plains states represented a threat to democratic political coalitions that required visible action. Hugh Hammond Bennett had been arguing for soil conservation policy since the 1920s, when he was a soil scientist with the Bureau of Chemistry and Soils and was producing reports about the accelerating loss of American topsoil to erosion that the agricultural establishment largely ignored. When Bennett was called to testify before a Senate subcommittee in May 1934, a dust storm from the Plains states was tracking toward Washington, and Bennett, who was aware of the forecast, extended his testimony long enough for the dust to arrive visibly in the committee room. Senators sitting in Washington, watching the light dim and the air fill with the soil of Oklahoma and Texas, were persuaded of the need for federal soil conservation policy in a way that reports and statistics had not achieved. The Soil Conservation Service was established in 1935, with Bennett as its first director. Congress appropriated funds soil conservation became federal policy. The method of persuasion, wait for the evidence to walk into the room on its own, has not been widely adopted in subsequent legislative contexts. The Shelter Belt Project was the New Deal's most ambitious ecological intervention in the Dust Bowl region, and it was also the most widely mocked when it was announced. Franklin Roosevelt proposed in 1934 that the federal government plant a continuous belt of trees from Texas to the Canadian border, 100 miles wide, running north to south across the Great Plains, to function as a windbreak, reducing wind velocity and preventing the lift of topsoil from bare fields. The forestry establishment pointed out that trees did not naturally grow on the central Great Plains for good reasons related to rainfall and soil. The press referred to it as Roosevelt's folly and suggested that the president had perhaps misread a map. The Shelter Belt Project planted approximately 200 million trees across 30,000 miles of windbreaks between 1935 and 1942, mostly in a narrower corridor than the original plan, specified and mostly of species selected for drought tolerance. And the windbreaks that survive, many were removed in subsequent decades by farmers who wanted more cropland. Demonstrably reduce wind velocity, reduce soil moisture evaporation, and protect crops from the desiccating winds that cross the plains. Roosevelt's folly worked. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration paid plains farmers to take land out of production, providing a federal subsidy that acknowledged implicitly what the Farm Bureau and the Agricultural Extension Services had been reluctant to say explicitly, that the amount of land being farmed on the southern plains was too much for the land to sustain. The soil conservation programs taught farmers contour ploughing, strip cropping, and the maintenance of cover crops through the winter, techniques that had been advocated by agronomists for decades, and that had been widely ignored because they were less immediately profitable than planting wheat on every available acre. The combination of federal payments for reduced acreage, federal technical assistance for changed practices, and the eventual return of rainfall after 1939 allowed the agricultural system of the southern plains to recover to something like viability. The recovery was real. It was also partial. The topsoil lost in the 1930s did not come back. Topsoil forms at a rate of about an inch per every 100 years under natural conditions. The Dust Bowl blew away inches in a season. The rains returned gradually through the late 1930s. The native grasses that had been left in the grassland preserves and along the creek bottoms began to spread back into the ploughed fields that had been taken out of production. The communities that had stayed, the ones that had not been entirely abandoned, the towns where some families had remained through the worst of it, where the schools stayed open and the church stayed open, and someone kept the hardware store running on whatever credit and stubbornness could sustain, began to function again. The people who came back found a changed landscape, depleted soil, reduced populations, and a set of agricultural practices that had been modified, under enormous pressure, towards something more likely to last. Not the version they had arrived to build, something different, harder, more calibrated to what the land could actually sustain. That calibration cost 10 years and enormous human suffering, and a quantity of topsoil that is never coming back, which is the price the land extracted for being treated as something it was not. The Dust Bowl is not past in the sense that its conditions cannot recur. The southern Great Plains have experienced severe droughts since the 1930s. The drought of the 1950s was, in some meteorological measures, as severe as the 1930s drought. And the reason it did not produce a second Dust Bowl was that the soil conservation practices introductive. In the 1930s had been widely adopted, that the native grass cover had partially recovered, and that the Ogallala Aquifer had begun to be used for irrigation, providing a water source that could partially buffer the effects of surface drought. The Ogallala Aquifer is a vast underground reservoir of water that accumulated over millions of years from glacial meltwater and precipitation, lying beneath the Great Plains from South Dakota to Texas. And it is being depleted by irrigation at rates that are not sustainable. The people farming the southern plains today are drawing down a geological legacy of water accumulated over millions of years to sustain agricultural practices that the surface climate of the region cannot support without supplemental irrigation, which sounds like a sustainable, long-term arrangement, until you remember that they said essentially the same thing about the native grassland in 1910. The topsoil of the Great Plains took 10,000 years to form from the slow decomposition of grass roots and the death and rebirth of the prairie ecosystem through drought and fire and the passage of enormous herds. The wheat that replaced it took 16 years to eliminate the grassland. The dust that blew away in the 1930s is not coming back on any timescale relevant to human civilization. The communities that were abandoned during the worst years, the towns where the school closed and the elevator closed, and the last family finally loaded their truck and drove west, have not all come back. There are ghost towns on the southern plains that were thriving communities in 1920, and that are visible today only as a water tower and a concrete foundation, and the grid of streets that no one drives on anymore, because the streets lead to foundations and foundations lead to nothing. The land around those foundations is farmed. The people who farm it have learned, in most cases, to farm it in ways that do not repeat exactly what happened in the 1930s. The drought will come again. The wind has not changed. You are here now, somewhere with a roof over your head and a glass of water available if you want it, and the air in your room is clear. The sounds outside are whatever sounds the night makes where you are. Traffic or wind or the silence of a rural area at 2 a.m. The people who lived through the Dust Bowl years knew that the land could turn on you. They knew it in their lungs, in the grit between their teeth, in the hour they spent shoveling the doorway after every storm. The ones who rebuilt learned to hold the land differently, not as a resource to be extracted, but as a system to be maintained, not as a guarantee, but as a condition that could be lost. That knowledge cost them everything they had. It is available to anyone who wants it for the price of paying attention. Dim the lights. Sleep. Well, the wind has been still all evening. The specific geography of the Dust Bowl region matters because it explains why this particular part of the Great Plains was the one that turned to dust, rather than some other part of the semi-arid interior. The region known as the Oklahoma and Texas Panhandles, the southeastern corner of Colorado, the southwestern corner of Kansas, and the northeastern corner of New Mexico, forms a roughly triangular area sometimes called the Tri-State region, and sometimes just called the Southern Plains. And what makes it specifically vulnerable is the combination of factors that seemed, in the optimistic language of the early 20th century, to make it ideal for dryland wheat farming: flat terrain that was easy to plough, deep dark soil with high organic content from 10,000 years of grassland, low enough rainfall to kill most competing vegetation and concentrate the growth into wheat, and prevailing westerly winds that, in normal years, simply moved across the landscape without lifting anything. The same flat terrain that made ploughing easy had no topographic features to slow the wind. The same dry climate that seemed to favour wheat over weeds meant that the soil dried to a fine powder when not held by roots. The same depth of the dark native soil meant that when the grassland was stripped and the rains failed, there was an enormous quantity of loose organic material available to the wind. And the wind on the southern plains in spring is not gentle. The wind on the southern Great Plains in March and April and May blows from the southwest at an average velocity that would be considered a moderate wind anywhere with a vegetation cover to slow it at ground level. Across bare ploughed fields, the same wind velocity behaves differently because there is nothing at ground level to interrupt the flow. Wind moving across bare soil accelerates slightly near the surface as it loses the friction that vegetation would provide, and at a critical velocity, roughly 13 miles per h-hour, depending on the particle size of the soil, it begins to lift and carry the topmost particles. The saltation process, in which particles lifted by the wind bounce back to the surface and kick up additional particles, is self-reinforcing. Once a dust storm begins on a bare field, the disturbance propagates outward as the saltating particles strike the surface and launch more particles. A moderate spring wind across bare farmland in the southern plains could initiate a dust event that grew as it moved, gathering mass from each new field it crossed, until by the time it had crossed 100 miles of bare cropland, it was something categorically different from the wind that had started it. This is why the major Dust Bowl storms were not just high wind events. They were the accumulated topsoil of an entire agricultural region, mobilized simultaneously, moving east. The specific soil of the southern plains that gave the Dust Bowl its particular character was in many places loess, a fine-grained sediment deposited by wind action during the ice ages, when the great ice sheets of the north ground rock to powder, and the prevailing winds distributed that powder across the interior of the continent. Loess soils are extraordinarily fertile, because their fine particle size provides a large surface area for the chemical reactions of plant nutrition, and they hold water well, and their depth in the southern plains measured in many areas from 4 to 8 feet of dark organic material. They are also, when dry and unprotected by vegetation, exactly the kind of soil that moves. The Ice Age winds that deposited the loess in the southern plains and created the deep fertility that attracted the homesteaders were, in a specific geological irony, simply running in reverse in the 1930s. The same fine particles that wind had deposited over 10,000 years were being lifted again by the same westerly winds and moved again. Not so far this time, but far enough to make the southern plains effectively uninhabitable. The ranchers who preceded the sodbusters on the southern plains had a different relationship to the land that the wheat farmers who replaced them would have been well advised to understand. The cattle ranches of the late 19th century, the enormous operations that ran tens of thousands of cattle across unfenced grassland, were also destructive of the native ecosystem in their way, through overgrazing that removed the vegetative cover and compacted the soil with hooves. But the ranchers, or at least the observant ones among them, understood that the grassland required management and rest periods, that the native grasses could recover from grazing if given time, and that the carrying capacity of the land was not infinite. The cattle drives ended partly because the grassland could not sustain them indefinitely. The wheat farmers who broke the sod did not have the benefit of 30 years of overgrazing as a lesson. They had the benefit of good prices and cheap credit, and the overwhelming cultural message that the land existed to be farmed, and that farming it was both economically rational and morally correct. They broke the sod. The lesson cost more than the lesson before it. The jackrabbit drives of the early 1930s are one of the grimmer and less often discussed aspects of Dust Bowl history, and they tell you something specific about the psychology of desperation. The jackrabbits of the southern plains, deprived of the native grasses that had sustained them in normal years, turned to the crops and the kitchen gardens, and the hay that the farmers were desperately trying to maintain. A single jackrabbit consumes roughly the same amount of forage as a sheep, and the jackrabbit population on the dust-covered southern plains in the early 1930s was estimated in the hundreds of thousands. The farmers organized community rabbit drives, surrounding a section of land with a crowd of people who advanced toward a central pen, driving the rabbits ahead of them, and then killing the rabbits in the pen. Estimates range from a few hundred to several thousand rabbits per drive, using clubs and fence posts, because ammunition was expensive. The photographs of these drives, rows of dead jackrabbits stretched out to demonstrate the count, have the specific quality of photographs of things that were done out of necessity, and that became embarrassing once the necessity had passed. The rabbits were eating the food. The farmers killed the rabbits. The land was equally indifferent to both of them. The grasshoppers came in some years, an additional dimension of agricultural catastrophe layered on top of the drought and the dust. Drought conditions favor grasshopper population explosions because the dry soil provides ideal egg incubation conditions, and the southern plains in dry years supported grasshopper swarms large enough to darken the sky, which had already been darkened by dust, giving the agricultural landscape of the mid-1930s an almost competitive quality of atmospheric obscuration. Grasshoppers consume crops with an efficiency that requires direct observation to fully appreciate. A field that was standing in the morning could be bare by the afternoon. Farmers reported their standing wheat stripped in hours, their kitchen garden destroyed before lunch, the wooden handles of their tools pitted by the mandibles of insects searching for moisture. The grasshoppers ate fence posts. Not metaphorically, they consumed the wood of unpainted fence posts for the moisture content. A landscape that was simultaneously losing its topsoil to wind and its vegetation to insects and its water table to drought, had achieved a kind of comprehensive hostility toward human habitation that went beyond what the homesteaders' promotional literature had prepared them for. The children of the Dust Bowl grew up in an environment that was specifically designed by accident to produce a particular kind of psychological formation, one organized around precariousness, around the understanding that conditions could change catastrophically between morning and afternoon, around the specific skill of reading a sky for the signs that meant you needed to be inside in the next 20 minutes. The children who grew up on the southern plains in the 1930s learned to read the color of the horizon the way children in other environments learn to read street signs or bus schedules. As survival information, not background scenery. They learned what static electricity in the air felt like before a storm, the specific prickling of the skin and the way their hair moved. They learned that the cloth over the nose and mouth was not optional. They learned that a cough in the night was not necessarily a cold. The adults around them were under a form of economic and physical stress that even the most resourceful adults in the most difficult circumstances eventually transmits to children, and the children of the Dust Bowl years absorbed that stress in ways that shaped who they became, not always negatively, but durably. The people who grew up in the Dust Bowl had a specific quality of material minimalism, a specific unwillingness to trust that good conditions would continue, that people who knew them in later life found notable. The role of women during the Dust Bowl is consistently underrepresented in the historical account, partly because the dominant narrative is organized around the failure of farming, a male-coded activity, and the migration west, and partly because the labor that women performed to maintain household life under dust storm conditions left no public record. The work of keeping a household functional during a dust storm was enormous and largely invisible. The wet rags stuffed into window frames, the damp cloths hung over food, the constant cleaning of surfaces that would be covered again within hours, the maintenance of enough stored food and water to sustain the household through the days when leaving was not safe, the management of children's fear, the maintenance of social connections with neighbours across distances that meant physical visits were rare and correspondence was intermittent. The women who stayed on the southern plains through the worst of the Dust Bowl years were doing work that did not produce anything measurable in the agricultural statistics that historians use to document the disaster. They were keeping families alive. The record of their work is the fact of survival. The churches and schools that stayed open in Dust Bowl communities were the institutional structure that prevented complete social dissolution, and their persistence through the worst years was a form of collective determination that required continual effort to maintain. A country school with 12 students whose families were actively considering leaving required a teacher willing to come to work on days when the sky was brown by 9 in the morning, and a school board willing to pay the teacher with funds that the county was running out of, and parents willing to send their children to a building that would be gritty with dust by afternoon, and children willing to sit in a room that was dustier than their house, because the house at least had wet rags on the windows. The fact that any of this happened is slightly remarkable. The fact that it happened in hundreds of communities across the southern plains for years is what a functioning civil society looks like under conditions that were designed to destroy it. The experience of black farmers in the Dust Bowl region has a specific dimension that the dominant narrative usually omits. African American farmers on the southern plains occupied a position at the intersection of racial discrimination and agricultural disaster that doubled the difficulty of both. Black families who had acquired land through the Homestead Act or through purchase after the Civil War faced the same drought and dust conditions as white farmers, and they faced those conditions with less access to the federal credit and relief programs that the New Deal was distributing, with less ability to find agricultural work in California, because California's agricultural labor market discriminated by race as well as by Okie origin, and with land that had in many cases been in the family for 1 or 2 generations, and that represented an accumulation of capital achieved under conditions that made capital accumulation structurally more difficult. The photographs that became iconic images of the Dust Bowl, Dorothea Lange's work, the FSA photographs of Walker, Evans and Russell Lee, are overwhelmingly photographs of white poverty, because the photographers were, with some exceptions, photographing the white migration that was politically salient to the New Deal coalition. The black families who stayed in the Dust Bowl region, or who took different routes out of it, left a less documented historical record. They were there. The dust was the same. The federal relief programs that the New Deal deployed in the Dust Bowl region were a genuine commitment of federal resources to an agricultural disaster on a scale that the United States had not previously attempted. The Farm Security Administration, the Soil Conservation Service, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, these were not merely bureaucratic formations. They were institutions that deployed real people to real places with real tools and real funding, and the people who staffed them were, in many cases, people who believed in what they were doing with an intensity that is difficult to recreate in institutional settings that have not been formed in response to an emergency. The CCC workers who planted trees for the Shelter Belt project were young men from unemployed families who were being paid by the federal government to do physical work in difficult conditions, and many of them had no previous connection to the land they were planting trees on. They planted the trees anyway. The trees, in most cases, grew. The photographic record of the Dust Bowl is one of the most important documentary photography archives in American history, produced largely by photographers working for the Farm Security Administration under the direction of Roy Stryker, who had a theory about documentary photography that he pursued with considerable persistence and some manipulation. The FSA photographers, Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Russell Lee, Arthur Rothstein, Gordon Parks and others, were sent to document the conditions of rural poverty and agricultural displacement during the Depression, and the photographs they produced were intended for publication in newspapers and magazines, to build political support for New Deal programs. Arthur Rothstein's famous photograph of a farmer and his sons walking through a dust storm near Cimarron County, Oklahoma, in April 1936. The image of the small figure leaning into the wind with a child pressed against his leg, moving toward a low wooden structure barely visible through the haze, was staged. Rothstein moved the skull prop for a different photograph, creating a controversy about documentary authenticity that persisted for decades. The staging did not make the dust less real. The people leaning into wind on the southern plains in 1936 were not staged. They were there. Rothstein was just trying to help you see what they were walking through. Walker Evans photographed Alabama sharecropper families the same year. And the gap between his photographs and the lives of the people he photographed, the way a photograph taken without consent of people living in poverty is simultaneously a record and an act, was a question that James addressed in the text he wrote to accompany the photographs. In Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the Dust Bowl photographs produced a similar ethical tension between the genuine need to show the country what was happening on the southern plains and the specific indignity of photographing poverty as evidence for political arguments made by people who were not themselves going hungry. Florence Owens Thompson, the woman in Migrant Mother, said she had been told the photographs would not be published. They were published. The photograph made Dorothea Lange famous. It did not help Florence Owens Thompson buy food. The New Deal conservation programs did not stop the dust storms, because dust storms are a meteorological phenomenon, and the federal government cannot prevent meteorology. What the programs did was reduce the vulnerability of the landscape to the next drought, through the combination of reduced cultivation of the most marginal land, increased soil cover from contour, ploughing and strip farming, and cover crops, the planting of windbreaks at reduced wind velocity at the surface, and the gradual re-establishment of native grass cover on land taken out of cultivation. The improvement was real and measurable. The dust storms of the 1950s drought, a drought of comparable severity to the 1930s, produced far less total topsoil loss, because the landscape had been partially stabilized by the conservation practices of the intervening decade and a half. The lesson about soil conservation had been learned, at enormous cost, and the learning had been institutionalized in ways that outlasted the emergency that produced it. The specific experience of going through a dust bowl dust storm in a car is one of the details that the historical record preserves in enough first-person accounts to reconstruct. You are driving across the Texas Panhandle in April 1935. The sky ahead of you is brown at the edges. You watch it for a few minutes and it does not improve. You are 10 miles from the next town and 5 miles from the last one, and there is no structure visible from the road. The wall of dust reaches you, and the light goes from orange to brown to effectively zero over approximately 90 seconds. And you cannot see the road ahead of you, and you cannot see the ditch beside the road. And if you continue driving, you will end up in the ditch or in the path of another car that also cannot see you. You stop the car. You turn off the engine, because the engine is already pulling dust into the air filter, and running it will not help. The dust comes through the firewall, and the door seals in the gap around the windshield. The temperature inside the car drops. The static electricity has already shorted out your radio. You sit in your car, in the dark, in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of Texas, holding a handkerchief over your face, and you wait. This is not a metaphor. This is a description of a regular experience for people driving on the southern plains in the mid-1930s, and the people who experienced it regularly developed a specific pragmatic attitude toward it. The way people who live near volcanoes develop a pragmatic attitude toward eruptions. That normalized an experience that should not have been normalized. The specific towns of the Dust Bowl region have names that do not appear in most American history textbooks, and that are worth knowing. Boise City, Oklahoma, which recorded the highest dust storm frequency of any location in the United States during the 1930s, with measurable dust storm conditions on over 100 days in some years. Dalhart, Texas, where a man named John McCarty founded the Last Man's Club in 1935, an organization whose members signed a pledge to remain in the Dust Bowl, no matter what happened, with the understanding that the last remaining member would mark the graves of all the others. Liberal Kansas, which had established enough economic infrastructure that it survived the decade with something resembling its institutional structure intact. Guymon, Oklahoma, which is the county seat of Texas County, the Oklahoma county with the highest elevation on the high plains, and one of the hardest hit during the worst storm years. These are not famous places. They did not produce presidents or industrial revolutions. They produced the specific American experience of trying to maintain a community on land that had decided it was finished with the current arrangement, and of finding that the impulse to stay was stronger than the evidence that suggested leaving. The Last Man's Club of Dalhart deserves specific attention, because its psychology encapsulates something about the Dust Bowl that is otherwise difficult to articulate. John McCarty was the editor of the Dalhart Texan, and a man who had committed his professional identity to the proposition that the Texas Panhandle was a viable place to build a life, and who experienced the Dust Bowl years not only as a community disaster, but as a personal challenge to everything he had been writing in his newspaper. The Last Man's Club, which he founded partly as a genuine expression of commitment, and partly as a public relations strategy, to prevent a psychological cascade that he feared would empty the town, attracted signatures from prominent local citizens, and from people who had nothing left to lose because they had already lost most of it. The pledge to stay was simultaneously brave and slightly absurd. Some of the men who signed it left, some died. John McCarty stayed. The town of Dalhart still exists, which is either the vindication of his commitment or simply the outcome of other factors he could not have predicted. History has a habit of making stubbornness look wise in retrospect and foolish in prospect, and you cannot tell which you are looking at until after it is over. The radio was the technology that changed the experience of living through the Dust Bowl years in ways that the historical record does not always emphasize, because the radio was new. The first commercial radio broadcasts in the United States began in 1920, and by the mid-1930s, the radio had become the primary source of news and weather information for rural households across the Great Plains, including the households that were most isolated by the deteriorating conditions. A farm family in the Oklahoma Panhandle in 1935 could hear the storm warnings that the weather stations were broadcasting, could hear the news of what the storms were doing to other communities, could hear Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats explaining what the federal government was trying to do about the situation, and could hear the music and comedy programs that provided a few hours of something that was not the dust. The radio was the first technology that allowed genuinely isolated rural communities to participate in the shared national experience in real time, and the specific content of what those communities were hearing, the New Deal programs, the weather warnings, the presidential reassurances, shaped how they understood their own situation and their relationship to a government that was, for the first time in American history, treating an agricultural disaster as a national emergency, rather than a local misfortune. The sound of Franklin Roosevelt's voice on the radio in the Dust Bowl years is a detail that most of the people who heard it took to their graves, but enough accounts survive to know that it mattered, specifically because of what it was not. It was not the voice of someone telling farmers that they had made their situation and were responsible for getting out of it. It was the voice of someone explaining that the situation was complicated, and that the federal government had a plan, and that the plan was going to involve specific programs in specific counties, and that those programs had money behind them, and that the money was real. Whether you agreed with the politics or not, and many of the farmers of the Southern Plains were Republicans who had substantial reservations about the New Deal on political and economic grounds. The experience of hearing the President of the United States describe your situation as a national problem worth federal resources was a qualitative shift from the experience of the previous 10 years, during which the political message had been that hard work and individual responsibility were sufficient for any challenge the American continent presented. They were not sufficient. The radio told you what was happening. The President told you he was doing something about it. Both were a form of contact with a world outside the dust that mattered to people who had been sitting in it for years. The Civilian Conservation Corps workers who came to the Southern Plains in the 1930s were young men from the urban Northeast and Midwest who had never seen the Great Plains, and who were being deployed to plant trees and build erosion control structures in conditions that nothing in their previous experience had prepared them for. The dust storms that hit the CCC camps on the Southern Plains were educational experiences for workers from New York and Chicago who had understood dust as something you wiped off furniture. The CCC workers planted the windbreak trees of the Shelter Belt Project, built the terraces and water diversion structures of the Soil Conservation Program, constructed the ponds and the dams of the watershed management efforts, and in doing so acquired a direct physical knowledge of the land they were working on that the official reports they generated did not capture. Many of them were 18 and 19 years old. They were being paid $30 a month, of which 25 was sent home to their families. They worked in the heat and the dust and the cold of the high plains, through conditions that were genuinely difficult, and the people of the Dust Bowl communities, who had reason to be suspicious of federal programs, staffed by outsiders, generally remember the CCC workers with something approaching affection. They were there. They were doing the work. In the specific conditions of the southern plains in the 1930s, showing up and doing the physical work had a value that transcended any ideological disagreement about whether the government should be doing it. The specific smell of a dust storm is preserved in enough survivor accounts that it can be reconstructed, a combination of dry earth, something slightly electrical from the static charge in the air, and a faint sweetness from the decaying organic matter in the topsoil that was being moved. The organic matter in native prairie soil, the accumulated root systems and decomposed plant material of 10,000 years, had a characteristic smell when freshly disturbed, a smell that under normal conditions you encountered when ploughing, and that under dust bowl conditions you encountered when the entire field was moving through the air. Some survivors described it as the smell of old bread. Some described it as the smell of the earth itself, concentrated. The smell arrived before the visual wall of the storm in some accounts, a few minutes ahead of the darkness, which is consistent with the way fine dust particles scatter ahead of the main storm body. You could smell it coming. That specific detail, that the disaster had a smell, that the sensory system of the body registered the arrival of the storm through multiple channels, simultaneously, is the kind of thing that historical accounts usually omit because it does not fit in a table of statistics, but that people who lived through it remember decades later with complete precision. Food preservation during the dust storms was a practical challenge that required the adaptation of every domestic skill to conditions that domestic practice had not been designed to manage. Canned goods were safe as long as the cans were sealed. Fresh produce was not safe because the dust settled on every surface and penetrated every covering but was not airtight. Bread baked on the day of a storm was gritty before it was cool. Butter left uncovered was covered in dust before the meal was finished. The families who managed the dust best were the ones who had adapted their domestic practice to the new conditions most completely, who stored everything in covered containers, who cooked covered when possible, who planned meals around the storm schedule when a storm schedule was predictable, which it increasingly was not. The adaptation of domestic practice to extreme environmental conditions is a form of human resilience that is not heroic in the traditional sense. It is not courage in the face of danger so much as the slow adjustment of routine to new reality, but it is the form that resilience takes when the danger is persistent rather than acute, when the emergency is not a single event, but a condition of daily life that continues for months and then years. The specific experience of a community watching itself empty is qualitatively different from the experience of an individual deciding to leave, and the Dust Bowl communities that stayed experienced both simultaneously. You watch the Hendersons leave in October. Their house is empty through the winter. In April, the Kowalski family loads their truck, and you help them because that is what neighbours do. And then their house is empty, and 2 houses on your road are dark at night. By the following fall, the school has lost enough students that the county is considering consolidating it with a school in the next township. The hardware store closes because the owner's family left, and there are not enough customers remaining to justify the inventory. The Methodist Church and the Baptist Church are still operating, but they are combining their congregations for Wednesday night services because neither one has enough people to fill the pews on its own. The grain elevator is still operating because whoever has grain still needs somewhere to sell it. The bank is still open, but the banker knows almost everything about the financial condition of every remaining family, and the knowledge is not reassuring. The community is not gone. It is thinner. The space between people is larger. The social fabric is the same fabric, just stretched across more distance. And fabric stretched across more distance eventually shows the gaps between the threads. The medical situation in the Dust Bowl region was a compounding factor in a compounding disaster. The doctors who practiced in the small towns of the southern plains in the 1930s were dealing with conditions that their training had not included. Dust pneumonia, which was not in the medical textbooks because it had not previously existed as a clinical entity in the United States at this scale. Malnutrition in children of farming families whose food supply had been reduced, dadd by 3 or 4 consecutive crop failures. The specific psychological presentations of people living under chronic stress for extended periods, which the medical vocabulary of the 1930s categorized as nervous disorders, and which were in many cases clinical depression, anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress, by whatever name you choose to give them. The county health nurses who drove the rural roads of the southern plains in the 1930s, visiting isolated farm families and providing whatever medical care they could with whatever supplies they had, were doing work that would now be classified as disaster medicine under conditions that the public health system had not prepared for. Some of them were recently trained graduates of nursing schools who had taken positions in rural areas because the positions were available. They drove roads that were sometimes closed by dust drifts. They saw things that the medical curriculum had not prepared them to see. The mental health dimension of the Dust Bowl is something that the historical record preserves primarily in the accounts of doctors and nurses and social workers who observed the population during the crisis, because the people experiencing it did not, in most cases, describe their inner lives in terms that the historical archive captures. What the observers noted was an increase in the frequency of what they called nervous breakdowns, a category that covered a range of presentations from acute anxiety to dissociative episodes. A specific fatalism about the future that was qualitatively different from the ordinary pessimism of people in difficult situations, and that suggested a fund-to-fund mental revision of the belief that effort produced outcomes, a withdrawal from social contact that compounded the already increasing isolation of the thinning communities, and, in a smaller number of documented cases, a specific acute episode that some observers called Dust Bowl psychosis, a state of mental disturbance apparently triggered by the combination of the physical environment, the economic stress, and the sense of complete loss of control over the conditions of life. The psychological toll of living for years in conditions of dust and drought and debt and departure was real, measurable in the behaviour of the people living in it, and largely invisible in the historical record that emphasises material condition. The suicide rate in drought affected Great Plains counties in the 1930s was measurably higher than the national average, and higher than the rate in comparable non-drought counties during the same period, which is a statistic that the historical record does not foreground because it is, even now, a difficult thing to write about in the context of a narrative that emphasises resilience. Resilience and despair coexisted in the Dust Bowl communities, the way they coexist in any population under sustained stress. The same community that produced the Last Man's Club and the community fundraisers and the church ladies who organised food distribution also produced men who walked into the barn and did not come out. Both were responses to the same conditions. The resilience narrative, which is the narrative that Americans prefer about American disasters, is true as far as it goes. It does not go as far as the complete human picture, which includes the people who did not make it to the other side. The specific experience of arriving in California as an Okie was the experience of being in a place that wanted your labour and did not want you. The agricultural valleys of California, the San Joaquin Valley, the Imperial Valley, the Sacramento Delta, had by the mid-1930s developed a labour system based on a seasonal migrant workforce that moved through the crops as they ripened, working for wages that were set by the growers with no effective labour organising to contest them, living in conditions that ranged from tolerable to deliberately degrading. The Dust Bowl migrants arrived into this system, speaking a recognisable dialect of American English, sharing a recognisable culture with the people who were supposed to be helping them, and they were treated as a problem rather than a population. The specific vocabulary of contempt, Okies, Arkies, Dust Bowlers, expressed the California agricultural establishment's need to distinguish the migrants from themselves on some basis other than economic class, which was the actual distinction, but which was an uncomfortable distinction to articulate in a country that maintained an official ideology of classlessness. The migrants were poor. California had plenty of poor people. What California did not want was poor people with no prior connection to the state's social fabric who might organise or vote or demand that the labour system change, which, eventually, some of them did. The labour organising in California's agricultural valleys in the late 1930s and early 1940s drew on the specific combination of desperation and competence that the Dust Bowl migrants brought with them. People who had farmed their own land, who understood agricultural labour from the inside, who had sufficient education to read and understand labour contracts, and who had lost enough that they were willing to take risks that a worker with more to lose might avoid. The union organising was met with violence from the growers' associations, with legal and political pressure, and with the cooperation of local law enforcement that was substantially funded by the agricultural interests it was protecting. The Okies who had come to California to survive were, within a few years, a political constituency capable of contesting the conditions under which they were expected to work. The people who had been driven off the land by drought and dust were, in their new location, the most economically and politically experienced workers in the fields. The growers who had wanted the labor without the people found that the people arrived with everything they had always had, except the land, and that was enough. The atmospheric science of the 1930s dust storms was not fully understood at the time, because the science of large-scale atmospheric dynamics and soil physics was still being developed, and because the instruments and data networks that would allow systematic measurement of dust transport did not yet exist in the form they take today. What the meteorologists of the period observed was that the major Dust Bowl storms were not simply high wind events, localized to a small area. They were continent-scale atmospheric phenomena, with dust from a single storm system detectable at sites thousands of miles from the source region. A major storm originating on the Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas border on a spring day would deposit measurable quantities of red, orange soil on the windowsills of New York City 3 days later, and ships in the Atlantic Ocean reported dust on their decks 5 days after the storms that produced it. The specific atmospheric mechanism, the lifting of fine soil particles into the high troposphere, where the jet stream and upper-level wind patterns carried them east, and sometimes north, was not unique to the 1930s. Dust transport on this scale had certainly occurred before, during previous droughts on the Great Plains, but the scale of cultivated bare soil available in the 1930s meant that the quantity of material available for lifting was orders of magnitude larger than in any previous drought. The Great Plains in a normal year with grassland cover might lose a few thousand tons of soil to wind erosion. The Great Plains in 1935, with 30 million acres of bare cultivated land, was losing hundreds of millions of tons. The international media coverage of the American Dust Bowl is an underappreciated dimension of the disaster's historical significance. European newspapers in the mid-1930s published extensive accounts of the dust storms and the migration, partly because the spectacle of American agricultural civilization eating itself was inherently newsworthy, and partly because the political context of the period, the Depression, the rise of fascism in Europe, the general sense that capitalist modernity was not delivering on its promises, made the American example useful for a variety of political arguments. Soviet newspapers used the Dust Bowl as evidence of the inherent instability of capitalist agriculture. European socialist press used it as an argument for collective farming. American conservative press described it as a temporary setback being addressed by American ingenuity. American progressive press described it as the predictable outcome of unregulated exploitation of the land under the profit motive. The actual farmers of the Oklahoma Panhandle were probably not closely following the European press coverage of their situation, but the fact that their disaster was being used as a rhetorical resource by every political faction on 2 continents tells you something about the Dust Bowl's symbolic weight in the global political moment of the 1930s. The prairie dog towns of the Great Plains, the extensive underground communities of black-tailed prairie dogs that had occupied hundreds of millions of acres of native grassland before European settlement, were systematically exterminated by federal and state programs through the early 20th century, on the theory that prairie dogs competed with cattle for grass, and that their burrow systems created hoof hazards for horses. The extermination programs used poison gas injected into burrow systems, and organized killing drives, and they were largely successful. Prairie dog populations were reduced by an estimated 90% before the Dust Bowl period. What the extermination programs did not account for was the role of prairie dogs in the grassland ecosystem, specifically their role in maintaining soil structure through their burrowing activity, which aerated the soil and created channels for water infiltration, and their role in creating the microhabitat that dozens of other species, including the black-footed ferret and the burrowing owl and the golden eagle, depended on. The prairie dog towns were a structural component of the ecosystem that the ranchers wanted to remove, and that the ecosystem needed to function. Their removal, along with the removal of the bison herds that had maintained the grazing patterns that the native grasses were adapted to, and the removal of the native grasses themselves through cultivation, was part of the comprehensive dismantling of the prairie ecosystem that made the Dust Bowl possible. You cannot take apart an ecosystem that took 10 million years to develop and expect the components to work correctly without each other. The specific population numbers of the Dust Bowl migration are difficult to pin down precisely because no one was counting in real time, and the census methodology of the period was not designed for tracking internal migration of this kind. The best historical estimates suggest that between 300,000 and 400,000 people left the southern Great Plains between 1930 and 1940. with the migration peaking in the years 1935 to 1937. Of these, a significant number went to California. The California Department of Agriculture estimated that approximately 200,000 Dust Bowl migrants arrived in the state during the decade. But California was not the only destination. Many families moved to cities in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, seeking wage work in industries that were themselves depressed. Some moved to the Pacific Northwest. Some moved to cities in the Midwest. The migration was not a single movement west along a single road. It was the dispersal of a population from a region that could no longer support it, in as many directions as there were connections to somewhere else. The Route 66 narrative, though accurate for a significant portion of the migrants, is a partial picture of a more complex population movement. The specific economics of the Dust Bowl migration are also worth understanding, because the popular image of Dust Bowl migrants as people who packed everything and left is accurate for some families and significantly inaccurate for others. The families who could leave were the families who had a truck, or could sell or borrow enough to buy one, and who had enough cash to cover fuel and food for a 2,000-mile drive and who had some prospect of employment at the other end, or at least the hope of one. The families who could not leave were the families who owned land that was mortgaged, where leaving would mean abandoning the equity, however depleted, that remained in the property, and whose debt structure required them to attempt another crop, even when the rational calculation suggested it was futile. Some of the families that stayed because they were in debt and could not afford to leave. Some stayed because they had arrived on the plains with nothing, and had spent 20 years building something, however damaged, and could not bring themselves to abandon it. The line between those two categories, unable to leave and unwilling to leave, was not always clear to the people standing on it. The specific experience of a dust storm at night is different from the daytime experience in ways that survive in enough accounts to reconstruct. You are asleep in the early hours of the morning, and the house begins to change its sound. The wind that was background noise when you fell asleep has become something with a different register, not louder necessarily, but denser, more present, as if the air itself has changed consistency. The temperature drops. You are awake before you know why you are awake. The cloth hung over the window is moving slightly where there should be no draft. You get up and in the hall you can feel the texture of the air against your face, the slight grittiness that means the storm has arrived while you were sleeping, and the dust is already inside the house. You go to the children's room. They are asleep. The sheet over the doorway is already dark at the lower edge where the dust has settled. You stand there for a moment in the dark house in the middle of a dust storm, and you make the calculation that there is nothing useful to do at 3 in the morning that will not wake the children. And you go back to bed and you lie in the gritty sheets and breathe through the cloth you have draped over your face, and you listen to the storm. And you wait for the morning when you will shovel the doorway and find out what the next day holds. The grain elevator is the building that defines the Great Plains skyline in a way that nothing else does. Visible from 20 miles in flat terrain, the cylindrical concrete towers of the elevator marking the location of a town before you can see any other structure, because the grain elevator is the tallest thing that most plains towns ever built, and the economic reason that most plains towns existed. Wheat farming requires storage, and storage at scale requires a facility that can receive grain from many farms, and hold it until prices or transportation logistics make selling advantageous. And that facility is the elevator, and the elevator required the railroad to connect it to markets, and the R. On Fee Key, Ale Road required enough elevator throughput to justify the stop, and the whole system required enough farms within hauling distance to fill the elevator, which determined the maximum spacing of towns on the plains at roughly the interval a horse and wagon could travel to an elevator, and back in a day. The loss of farms during the Dust Bowl years was the loss of the economic base that justified the elevators, and the loss of the elevators was the loss of the economic reason for the towns, and the towns that lost their elevators had lost something that could not easily be replaced. Some plains towns today exist primarily because the elevator is still there, and someone still needs it. Some towns do not exist anymore because the elevator left. The elevator is not a romantic feature of the landscape. It is the mechanism that connected the farm to the market, and without that connection, the farm cannot survive, and the town that the farm supported cannot survive either. The recovery of the native grassland in the areas that were taken out of cultivation during the Dust Bowl years was, in ecological terms, relatively rapid, which is to say that the native grasses re-established themselves within a decade or two, which is rapid by ecological standards and very slow by human standards. The soil bank program of the 1950s, which paid farmers to take marginal land out of production, and the conservation reserve program that succeeded it in the 1980s continued the process of returning cultivated land to grassland cover that the Dust Bowl emergency had begun. The areas of the southern plains that were allowed to return to native grass have, over the subsequent decades, recovered much of the structural complexity of the original prairie ecosystem, the deep root systems, the invertebrate communities in the soil, the perennial grasses that can survive drought by going dormant and re-emerging when the rains return. What they have not recovered is the bison, which are the ecological keystone of the prairie, and whose grazing patterns maintain the mosaic of shortgrass and midgrass prairie that the native ecosystem required. There are bison herds in conservation areas on the Great Plains, and the ecological research on their effects on grassland structure is unambiguous. Places with bison are more ecologically complex than places without them. The prairie without bison is a diminished version of itself, like a cathedral with the organ removed. It still stands. It is still recognizably what it is. But something central is missing. The 1950s drought on the Great Plains was, in meteorological terms, comparable to the 1930s drought in duration and severity. In terms of topsoil loss and human displacement, it was significantly less catastrophic, for reasons that illustrate what the conservation programs of the 1930s had actually achieved. The windbreak trees of the Shelter Belt project had matured over 15 years and were providing significant wind speed reduction across large areas of previously bare terrain. The soil conservation practices, contour ploughing, strip cropping, the maintenance of cover crops, had been widely adopted by farmers who had learned the cost of the alternative. The Conservation Reserve Program had taken the most marginal land out of annual cultivation. And the Ogallala Aquifer, which had barely been used in the 1930s, because the pumping technology did not yet exist at the necessary scale, was beginning to be used for irrigation in ways that buffered the effects of surface drought on crop production. The result was that the 1950s drought produced local hardship and some farm failures, but nothing approaching the continent scale topsoil loss and mass displacement of the 1930s. The lesson had been learned. The infrastructure built from that learning was working. The same drought conditions that had destroyed an ecosystem in the 1930s produced a manageable agricultural setback in the 1950s, because the landscape was no longer as vulnerable. The Ogallala Aquifer irrigation expansion that followed the 1950s drought was the development that transformed the southern Great Plains more thoroughly than anything since the original plough, up of the 1910s and 1920s, and it produced an agricultural productivity that the original homesteaders would have considered miraculous, while simultaneously setting up the next version of the same problem. Center pivot irrigation systems, which draw water from the Ogallala and spray it in circular patterns across fields, became widespread on the southern plains from the 1960s onward, and the result was the conversion of semi-arid land that would naturally support cattle grazing into highly productive irrigated cropland, growing corn, cotton, and continued wheat. The circular fields that the center pivot systems create are visible from commercial aircraft across the entire high plains. Green circles in a brown landscape, the visible signature of a technological intervention that has allowed farming in a place that cannot be farmed without it. The Ogallala is being depleted. This is known. The rate of depletion is measured annually. The projections of when the economically accessible water will be exhausted in various parts of the aquifer have been revised over the years as extraction rates have changed. But the direction of the revision has consistently been towards sooner. The southern plains towns that depend on Ogallala irrigation agriculture for their economic base are watching the water table drop, and they are making the same calculations. Stay and hope for a technological solution, or begin planning for a different future, that the farm families of the 1930s made about the dust. The environmental movement that emerged in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s drew specifically on the Dust Bowl as an example of what unconstrained resource extraction could do to a landscape in a short period of time. The historians and ecologists who wrote about the Dust Bowl for mid-century audiences, Donald Worster's Dust Bowl, The Southern Plains in the 1930s, published in 1979, remains the definitive academic account, framed the disaster explicitly as a consequence of the capitalist agricultural system's inability to manage the long-term sustainability of the resource base it depended on. The Dust Bowl became, in the environmental literature, an example of ecological catastrophe created by the intersection of market incentives, government land policy, and the specific cultural ideology of American frontier agriculture, the idea that land existed to be used, and that using it was both economically rational and morally correct. This framing was contested by agricultural economists, who pointed out that the farmers of the southern plains had made reasonable decisions given the information and incentives available to them, and that the solution was not the condemnation of capitalism, but the reform of the incentive structures that had produced the plough-up. Both framings captured something real. The land did not care which framework was correct. It just waited for the next drought. The legacy of the Dust Bowl in American agricultural policy is extensive and largely invisible in the way that insurance is invisible when it is working. The conservation programs that emerged from the Dust Bowl experience, the Conservation Reserve Program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the various conservation compliance provisions that tie farm subsidy payments to soil conservation practices collectively represent a permanent restructuring of the federal government's relationship to agricultural land management. The principle that the federal government has a legitimate interest in how private agricultural land is managed, because the degradation of private agricultural land through poor practices has public consequences that extend far beyond the property line, was established through the Dust Bowl and has never been fully reversed. Despite periodic political efforts to eliminate or defund the conservation programs, the people who established that principle, Hugh Bennett, Franklin Roosevelt, the members of Congress who voted for the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, probably did not think of themselves as establishing a constitutional precedent about the limits of private property rights in relation to land management. They were trying to stop the dust. The precedent was a side effect. The conservation tillage movement that developed in the decades after the Dust Bowl is one of the more counterintuitive agricultural revolutions in American history, because it was built on the insight that the most important thing a farmer could do for soil conservation was, to a significant extent, nothing. The traditional deep ploughing that the settlers of the southern plains had used, turning the soil over to a depth of 8 to 12 inches with a moldboard plough, which buried the crop residue from the previous harvest and created a clean seedbed, turned out to be exactly the wrong approach for a semi-arid landscape prone to wind erosion. The turned-over soil, deprived of the residue that held it in place, exposed to the drying effects of sun and wind, ground fine by subsequent tillage passes, was a material that the wind could lift and carry. The alternative, leaving the crop residue on the surface, planting the next crop through the residue with a minimum of soil disturbance, relying on herbicides rather than cultivation to control weeds, maintained soil cover through the vulnerable period between harvests, and reduced wind erosion dramatically. No, till farming, as it came to be called, went from a theoretical proposition advocated by conservationists in the 1950s and 1960s to the dominant agricultural practice on hundreds of millions of acres of American cropland by the early 21st century, for a combination of conservation and economic reasons. The economics were the key. No, till reduced fuel costs, reduced labour, reduced equipment wear, and in many cases increased soil moisture retention enough to improve yields in dry years. The ecological benefit was delivered by an economic benefit. This is the kind of alignment between conservation and profit that conservationists always hope for, and that arrives less frequently than the hope suggests. And when it arrived in the form of no-till farming, the adoption was rapid. The transformation of the Great Plains agricultural economy in the decades after the Dust Bowl was also the transformation of the Great Plains agricultural community, and the two are not separable. The mechanization that made no-till possible, the large tractors, the GPS, guided planting equipment, the precision application technology, also made it possible for a single operator to farm far more acres than had been possible in the 1930s, which meant that fewer farmers were needed to farm the same total acreage, which meant that the farm families that had populated the plains towns with their children, and their purchasing power, and their civic participation, were no longer there. The consolidation of farm operations, larger farms, fewer farm families, proceeded steadily from the 1950s onward, and its effects on the communities of the Great Plains were demographically what the Dust Bowl had produced in a compressed time frame, spread over a generation, rather than a decade. The schools that had consolidated in the late 1930s, because drought and migration had removed their students, consolidated again in the 1970s and 1980s, because farm consolidation had removed the farm families that would have produced the students. The hardware stores and the implement dealers and the grain elevators that had survived the Dust Bowl eventually closed, not because the land failed, but because the economic logic of large-scale modern agriculture does not require the same density of local service infrastructure that small-scale family farming did. The Dust Bowl did not kill the small-town Great Plains economy. It just accelerated a process that the economics of modern agriculture would have completed anyway. The specific demographic legacy of the Dust Bowl migration is visible in California, where the descendants of the Okie migrants became a significant element of the state's working class and its political culture. The Okies who arrived in the Central Valley in the 1930s settled, married, had children, and built communities that within a generation or two were California communities rather than transplanted Oklahoma communities. Though the connection to the Plains' origin persisted in family memory, in music, and in a specific orientation toward land and labor that the Okie migrants carried with them, Bakersfield became a center of a country music style, the Bakersfield sound associated with Buck Owens and Merle Haggard. That was explicitly connected to the working-class Plains culture of the Okie migrants, harder, twangier, less polished than the Nashville sound, more honest about economic difficulty and the specific pleasures available to people who did not have much money. Merle Haggard was born in 1937 in a converted railroad boxcar in Bakersfield, California, to parents who had come from Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl migration. He became one of the most important American country musicians of the 20th century, and the specific cultural formation that produced him. The Oklahoma origin, the California displacement, the working class identity, the consciousness of having come from somewhere and being somewhere else, runs through his music as a structural element, rather than a biographical detail. The oral history of the Dust Bowl, collected by researchers in the decades after the disaster, preserves a texture of experience that the photographic and statistical record cannot. The Federal Writers Project of the New Deal employed writers and researchers to collect oral histories across the country in the late 1930s, and the interviews conducted in the Dust Bowl region, with farmers who had stayed, with families preparing to leave, with county extension agents and school teachers and town merchants, are among the most valuable primary sources for understanding what the Dust Bowl felt like from the inside. What the oral histories convey consistently is not the heroism or the pathos that the retrospective accounts tend to foreground, but something more mundane and more difficult to articulate: the exhaustion of people who had been dealing with an intractable problem for years and who had run out of the emotional resources required to feel strongly about it. The acute crisis of the first bad storm or the first failed harvest had by the fourth or fifth year been replaced by a state of chronic endurance that was too tired for drama. The people in the oral histories are not inspiring, they are surviving. That is what sustained adversity actually looks like when you take the retrospective narrative frame away from it. The relationship between the Dust Bowl and the larger narrative of American history is complicated by the American mythology of failure and recovery, which tends to absorb every national disaster into a story of eventual triumph that validates the national character. The Dust Bowl gets absorbed into this narrative as a story about what happens when Americans make a mistake with the land and then fix it. The plow-up was a mistake. The conservation programs were the fix. The 1950s drought was the test of the fix, and the fix worked. This narrative is true in the narrow sense that the specific ecological conditions of the 1930s Dust Bowl have not been recreated. It is incomplete in the sense that the underlying conditions, climate variability, aquifer depletion, the economics of agricultural commodity production, the political difficulty of managing collective resources against the incentives of individual actors, are not resolved. The Dust Bowl was a specific crisis, produced by a specific combination of conditions. Some of those conditions have been changed. Some of them have not. The narrative of American resilience and problem solving is a comfort and a partial truth, and a potential obstacle to taking seriously the next version of the same problem, which is developing on a longer timescale and therefore in a political context that has more difficulty generating urgency. The climate of the Great Plains in the 21st century is changing in ways that the soil conservationists of the 1930s did not anticipate, and that the agricultural extension services of the present day are now trying to help farmers adapt to. The warming climate is extending the growing season at the northern end of the plains and shortening it at the southern end by increasing the frequency of extreme heat events during flowering. The precipitation patterns are shifting, with wet years wetter and dry years drier, increasing the volatility of agricultural conditions. The frequency and intensity of drought events is projected to increase. The wind patterns that drive dust transport across bare soil in dry years are not changing in ways that would reduce the risk of dust events if soil cover is lost. The conservation practices that were developed in response to the 1930s Dust Bowl are the same practices that soil scientists recommend for adapting to the changing climate of the 21st century. Maintain soil cover, minimize disturbance, keep roots in the ground. But the scale of the challenges is different because the human population in the region is different. The economic structure of agriculture is different, and the global context of food security is different. The people of the southern Great Plains are not in the same position as the homesteaders of 1910. They have more knowledge, more technology, more institutional support, and more complex economic relationships that make some adaptations easier and some harder. Whether that combination is sufficient is a question that will be answered by future events rather than past precedent. The return to the land after the worst of the Dust Bowl years, the families who came back, who rebuilt on land that had blown away and been replanted, who stayed through the recovery and the slow return of the grass, is a story that the historical record preserves less completely than the story of the Exodus, because people going somewhere dramatic is more documentable than people staying in one place and gradually improving their situation. What we know is that the population of the Dust Bowl counties began to stabilize in the early 1940s, partly because the rains returned, and partly because the wartime economy created employment opportunities in industrial cities that made staying on marginal farmland less attractive than it had been, and also less necessary. The families that stayed through the 1940s rebuilt on farms that were physically different from the farms they had started with. The soil had been depleted. The windbreaks had been planted. The conservation structures had been installed, and the farming practice had been modified. The farm that emerged from the Dust Bowl was a more conservative, more carefully managed version of the farm that had gone into it, with less total acreage in cultivation, more attention to soil cover, and a farmer who had been educated at considerable cost in what the land required to survive. The specific sound of the southern Great Plains on a calm evening in late summer, the insects, the occasional long note of a meadowlark, the grass moving in a wind that has settled below the threshold where it carries anything, is the sound of a landscape that has been through something and has come back to something like itself, though not exactly itself. The native grasses that return to the land that was taken out of cultivation are the same species that were there before. The blue grama and the buffalo grass and the side oats grama and the switchgrass in the moister areas. The root systems are rebuilding, year by year, the underground structure that holds the soil. The meadowlarks and the horned larks and the longspurs that breed in the short grass are there in numbers that would have been unimaginable in 1935. The dust storms still happen, and they still make the sky brown in spring, and they still deposit soil on windowsills as far east as the Mississippi River in bad years. The land is not finished being the land. The wind is not finished being the wind. The system has been stabilized, not resolved, because a landscape is not a problem with a solution, but a condition with a management history. And the management history of the Great Plains continues. The people who live on the southern Great Plains today, the ranchers and the dryland wheat farmers, and the irrigated grain farmers, and the people who work in the towns that serve them, carry the Dust Bowl in their regional memory, the way people carry the knowledge of a flood that destroyed the town a generation before they were born. It shapes the landscape, the windbreaks, the conservation terraces, the native grass waterways that interrupt the cultivated fields. It shapes the culture, the specific attention to soil moisture and wind forecast that any adult in the region has internalized. And it shapes the politics, the automatic support for federal crop insurance and conservation programs that Republicans in the Plains states support despite their general skepticism of federal programs, because they understand that the agricultural system of the region cannot survive without the federal backstop that the Dust Bowl taught their grandparents to demand. The Dust Bowl is not past. It is the explanation for many of the present conditions. You do not have to have lived through it to be shaped by it. The windbreaks are there, the conservation districts are there, the specific form of agricultural caution that characterizes the culture of the southern plains is there. These are the marks the disaster left on everything it touched, and they are legible to anyone paying attention. The livestock on the southern Great Plains during the Dust Bowl years died in ways that agricultural records document in numbers, and that survivor accounts describe in terms that the numbers do not capture. Cattle that were caught in the open during major dust storms suffocated. The dust was fine enough and dense enough to clog the respiratory systems of large animals within minutes of exposure. And cattle that could not find shelter died in the fields or drifted downwind against fences, piling up against the wire with their heads down and their nostrils packed with dust, in positions that the farmers found when the storm cleared. The specific cattle losses of the worst storm years, the estimates run into the tens of thousands of animals across the tri-state region in the mid-1930s, represented not just economic loss but the loss of the breeding stock, and the work animals that a farm's future depended on. A family whose milk cow died in a dust storm had lost both a source of food and a source of income. A family whose draft horses died had lost the power source for whatever cultivation they hoped to do next season. The federal government's emergency cattle purchase programs, which bought at low fixed prices, the animals that ranchers could no longer feed and that were too depleted to survive another season, were simultaneously relief programs and slaughter operations. And the cattle that the government bought were in many cases too poor to be worth the cost of transport to a slaughterhouse, which is why some of them were shot in the field and buried in mass graves rather than processed into food. This was humane by the standards available. It was also, to the families who watched it happen, the visible evidence that the agricultural system they had built their lives around had ceased to function. The winter wheat calendar created a specific pattern of vulnerability that shaped the Dust Bowl experience across the seasons. Winter wheat in the southern plains is planted in the fall, germinates and establishes a root system through the winter, and is harvested in early summer. The fall planting requires a seedbed, and preparing the seedbed requires cultivation, and cultivation of bare soil in the fall left the land exposed through the winter months when the wind was strongest and the soil moisture was lowest. Fields that had been ploughed and planted in October were bare until the wheat germinated in November or December, and in a drought year when the germination was thin or the seedling mortality was high, the fields were still largely bare through February and March and April, when the great storms of the mid-1930s occurred. The calendar of wheat farming was a calendar of vulnerability. The land was most exposed to the wind exactly when the wind was most dangerous, because the agricultural practice had been designed for a climate that provided enough winter moisture to keep the soil damp and the wheat growing through the vulnerable period. And the drought years were years when that moisture did not arrive, and the system fell apart at its most sensitive point. The county extension agents of the Great Plains were the federal and state government's point of contact with individual farmers during the Dust Bowl crisis, and their experience provides a view of the disaster from a specific intermediate position, educated enough to understand the science, embedded enough in the local community to understand the human situation, and equipped with institutional resources that were insufficient to the scale of what they were trying to address. The extension agents taught soil conservation practices that were later recognized as correct. They distributed relief seed for replanting after storm damage. They reported back to their state extension services on conditions that the state services reported to the federal agencies that were designing the relief programs. They also spent a great deal of time in the farmhouses of people who were in various stages of the decision about whether to stay or leave, and the records they kept of those visits. Reports, letters, oral histories are among the most precise documents of what the Dust Bowl looked like at the individual farm level. An extension agent in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, in 1936 was driving roads that were sometimes drifted with dust, visiting farms where the families were living on federal relief food and replanting fields that had blown out twice already, and doing the specific work of maintaining institutional contact with people who had reason to distrust institutions and who were running out of the practical hope that institutional contact requires to be productive. The church in the Dust Bowl communities served a function that is not reducible to theology. It was the institution that gathered the community in one place at regular intervals, that provided a social framework for mutual aid, that gave the calendar of an agricultural year a structure of communal observance, that connected people to each other and to something larger than their individual situations. The specific form of the Plains Christianity that prevailed in the Dust Bowl communities. Evangelical Protestant, denominated primarily as Methodist and Baptist with smaller communities of Catholic and Lutheran and Mennonite, oriented toward individual salvation and community obligation simultaneously, was well suited to the conditions of an agricultural crisis in its emphasis on endurance, its language of trial and faith, and its practical organization of collective support. The church ladies who organized the food distribution when the Red Cross relief arrived were not acting from abstract charity. They were acting from a specific institutional structure that already existed, that met every week, that knew which families needed help and which families could provide it, and that had been performing these functions long before the federal government arrived with food boxes. The federal relief programs worked partly because the community institutions were still functioning well enough to distribute what the federal programs delivered. The seed saving that Dust Bowl farmers practiced in the worst years, the deliberate retention of the best quality grain from a depleted harvest to use as seed for the following year, rather than selling it or consuming it, was one of the practical forms of hope that kept farming communities connected to the possibility of a future crop. Seed saving is an ancient agricultural practice that long predates the commercial seed industry, and it requires a specific form of optimism. You must believe that there will be a next year worth planting for. The families that maintained their seed stocks through the worst of the drought years were the families that were still capable of imagining planting. Some of them planted into drought conditions and watched the crop fail and replanted the following year. Some of them planted into the returning rains of the late 1930s and got a crop. The seed they had kept was the material expression of the conviction that they would be there to use it. That conviction was not always justified. When it was justified, the seed was there. The Postal Service maintained mail delivery to rural addresses on the southern Great Plains through the Dust Bowl years with a regularity that represented, for the isolated farm families, a form of connection to the larger world that was not dependent on road conditions or fuel availability. The rural route carrier, who drove the gravel roads in all weather conditions, except actual storm conditions, was bringing not just letters but catalogues, newspapers, and the government bulletins that described the relief programs that were available. A family that was considering leaving received correspondence. A family that was staying received seed catalogues and agricultural bulletins and letters from the children who had already left. The postal route was the circulatory system of a community whose other systems were failing, and the regularity of its operation. The mail coming on Monday and Thursday, regardless of what the weather had done to the road, was a form of institutional reliability that mattered specifically because so many other forms of reliability had stopped working. The comparison of the American Dust Bowl to Dust Bowl conditions elsewhere in the world is instructive about what was specific to the American experience and what was a general consequence of removing vegetation cover from semi-arid landscapes. The Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa experienced desertification through the late 20th century that was driven by a combination of drought and overgrazing similar in mechanism to the Great Plains plough-up, though operating through pastoralism rather than grain farming. The result, bare soil, reduced rainfall from the loss of vegetative moisture cycling, dust storms, displacement, was structurally identical to the American case. The Soviet Virgin Lands campaign of the 1950s and 1960s, which broke tens of millions of acres of Central Asian steppe and planted them with wheat, produced Dust Bowl conditions within a decade that were severe enough to trigger the collapse of the program and the abandonment of much of the newly cultivated land. The Chinese Loess Plateau, which had been cultivated for millennia and had lost most of its native vegetation, cover through a combination of agriculture, fuel wood cutting, and overgrazing, was producing enormous quantities of yellow dust that was depositing across Korea and Japan. The yellow dust events that residents of East Asian cities experience in spring are largely Chinese Loess Plateau soil, mobilized by the same wind, erosion mechanism that produced the Dust Bowl storms. The lesson of all of these cases is the same. Remove the vegetation from a semi-arid landscape, and the wind moves the soil. This is not a complex insight. It took humanity 10,000 years of civilizational development and the specific catastrophe of the 1930s American Dust Bowl to institutionalize the response to it. The specific quality of light on the southern Great Plains in summer, before the storms and after them, in the good years, is something that the people who grew up there describe with a precision that suggests the landscape left a permanent mark on how they experienced colour. The sky over the high plains is larger than the sky anywhere with tree cover or topographic relief, and the light in summer is a particular shade of blue that people from other regions sometimes describe as too much, too present, without the softening of distance that mountains or forests provide. The storms that turned that sky brown and then black were not just meteorological events. They were an assault on the specific sensory environment that people had grown up in, the particular quality of openness and light that defined what home looked like. The survivors of the Dust Bowl who moved away and later returned, or who carried the memory of the place for the rest of their lives, described the light over the plains with the intensity of something irreplaceable, something that existed fully only in the period before the dust, and that returned, slightly changed, when the dust was finally over. You are standing in a field on the southern Great Plains in the spring, and the sky is the colour it was before the storms. The wheat is up, green and moving in the wind that comes from the southwest at 14 miles an hour. The wind is below the threshold where it lifts the soil, because the soil is covered, because the roots are in the ground. The windbreak on the west side of the field is a line of cottonwoods and Russian olives that someone planted in 1937 or 1938. Trees that are taller than any natural feature of this landscape for 100 miles. their roots reaching 30 feet into the soil that they have been holding in place for 80 years. The field goes to the horizon in 3 directions. In the 4th direction, the windbreak stands. Everything you are looking at was either saved or rebuilt after a decade that tried to destroy it. Some of it is the original, recovered. Some of it is a replacement, grown back. The difference between the original and the replacement matters to the ecologist and not at all to the wind. The wind just wants to know if there are roots in the ground. There are roots in the ground. The homestead shacks that the first settlers of the southern plains built were not the substantial farmhouses of popular imagination. They were small wooden structures, often a single room, sometimes 2, with tar paper on the outside and whatever was available for insulation. That had been built quickly and cheaply, because the families who built them expected to replace them with something better once the farm was productive. The better structure was never built in many cases because the farm was never productive enough to generate the surplus that would have funded it, and the families lived in the temporary shelter that was supposed to be a starting point for years and then for decades. The walls of these structures had gaps between the boards and around the windows and under the doors because they had been built without the care that a permanent structure receives and because the wood had dried and shrunk in the plains climate. In the context of ordinary plains weather, these gaps were an inconvenience. In the context of a dust storm, they were the mechanism by which the storm entered the house. The families who stuffed them with rags and hung wet sheets over them were improvising solutions to a structural problem in real time, and the improvisation was never fully adequate because the structure had been built for a different set of conditions, and it performed differently than expected when those conditions changed. This is a description of the houses. It is also a description of the agricultural system they represented, the specific experience of the Native American nations, whose reservation lands occupied portions of the Dust Bowl region, adds a dimension to the disaster that the dominant narrative typically omits. The Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache peoples, whose reservation lands in western Oklahoma occupied territory at the edge of the Dust Bowl region, had been confined to those lands by treaty and by the allotment policies of the late 19th century, which had divided communally held reservation land into individual parcels, assigned to individual families, and opened the remainder to white settlement. The allotment policy had the specific effect of creating a checkerboard of Indian-owned and white-owned land that made coherent land management on either the ecological or the social level nearly impossible. The Indian families who farmed their allotted parcels under the same conditions as their white neighbors experienced the same drought, the same dust, the same crop failures, with the additional dimension that the federal trust relationship that was supposed to protect their land rights provided no practical protection against meteorological events, and that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was supposed to be administering those trust relationships, was an institution of famously limited effectiveness. The Dust Bowl struck the Indian families of western Oklahoma in the same way it struck everyone else. The difference was that the Indian families had already been through the confiscation of their land, the destruction of their traditional economy, the forced relocation of their children to boarding schools, and the allotment of their remaining land into parcels that were marginal from the beginning. The Dust Bowl was one disaster in a sequence that had been running for 60 years. The specific role of the Red Cross during the Dust Bowl years illustrates the relationship between private charity and federal relief that characterized the early years of the disaster before the New Deal programs were operational. The American Red Cross, which had been the primary vehicle for domestic disaster relief in the United States since the late 19th century, arrived in the Dust Bowl region in the early 1930s with food and clothing distributions that were genuinely helpful and structurally insufficient for the scale of the problem. The Red Cross model of disaster relief was designed for acute events, floods, fires, earthquakes, that displaced people for a limited period and then allowed them to return to something like their previous conditions. The Dust Bowl was not an acute event. It was a chronic condition that lasted a decade. The Red Cross could distribute food boxes for a season. It could not substitute for the agricultural income that had failed to materialize for 4 years in a row. The transition from Red Cross relief to federal New Deal programs was the transition from a charity model of disaster response to a structural model, from the assumption that disasters were temporary dislocations requiring emergency food and shelter to the recognition that some disasters required permanent restructuring of the economic and ecological systems that had produced them. The Dust Bowl forced that recognition on an American political system that had been deeply reluctant to make it. The horses on the southern plains during the Dust Bowl years occupy a specific place in the disaster narrative because they were both work animals and symbols of a farming culture that was being replaced by the tractors that had, in part, created the conditions for the disaster. Draft horses required feed, hay and grain. That was in short supply during the drought, and the families that could not afford to feed their horses sold them or shot them, which meant the loss of the power source for whatever cultivation remained possible with horse-drawn equipment. The families that transitioned from horses to tractors had made that transition on credit, and the debt from the tractor purchases was a significant component of the financial pressure that was driving farm failures. The tractor that replaced the horse was more powerful, could work more acres, and required no feeding between uses. But it required fuel, and fuel required cash. And cash was what the Dust Bowl families did not have. The economics of the transition from horsepower to mechanical power on the southern Great Plains in the 1930s was a transition that the families who made it could not afford to reverse and could barely afford to maintain. And they were caught between the old system, which required land and labour and horses and modest cash, and the new system, which required land and fuel and credit and more cash. The dust fell on both. The specific geography of Route 66 as a migration route is worth understanding because it shaped the experience of the migrants in ways that the simple distance from Oklahoma to California does not convey. The road ran southwest from Oklahoma City to Amarillo, then west through New Mexico to Albuquerque, then northwest through Gallup and Flagstaff to Needles, California, where it turned west across the Mojave Desert to Barstow, and then to Los Angeles. The Mojave crossing in summer, in a loaded vehicle with a radiator that might be marginal, was genuinely dangerous. People died in the Mojave, stopped on the side of the road in cars that had finally refused to continue, in heat that was capable of killing a person in a few hours without shade or water. The service stations and small towns along the route saw a continuous stream of loaded cars and trucks from 1935 onward, and the economic relationship between the migrants and the route was not always equitable. Prices for gasoline, oil, water, and roadside food were set by people who understood that the migrants had few alternatives, and the migrants paid what was asked because they had to. The specific exploitation of the Dust Bowl migrants by the commercial infrastructure of Route 66, the water stations charging for water that should have been free, the overpriced radiator repair at the only garage for 100 miles, is part of the route's history that the nostalgic Route 66 mythology tends to omit. The specific moment when the rain returned to the southern plains in the late 1930s is described in survivor accounts with a precision that suggests it was received as something close to a religious event. After years of failed crops and brown skies and the daily confrontation with the evidence that the land was not going to cooperate, the return of moisture to the soil was experienced as more than meteorological. It was the restoration of the basic compact between the farmer and the land, the confirmation that the effort of staying had been worth making. The grass that came back, the native species, not the wheat, the plants that had been there before the plough, and that had survived the drought in seed and in protected drawers and along fence lines, came back with a speed that surprised the people who watched it. A field that had been bare in April could be covered in native grass seedlings by July if the rains were sufficient. The root systems that had been destroyed by cultivation were not restored in a season, but the visual cover, the green that meant the wind could not lift the soil, returned faster than the structural restoration underneath it. The people who had stayed through the storms watched the land come back to something recognizable and took from it whatever it was they needed to take from it. The vindication of their stubbornness, the confirmation of their faith, the simple relief of not having to shovel the doorway tomorrow. The way the Dust Bowl changed American attitudes towards soil as a resource, rather than a medium, is one of its lasting contributions to the conceptual vocabulary of environmentalism. And it is a contribution that is rarely acknowledged in the way that Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac or Rachel Carson's Silent Spring are acknowledged, because it came from catastrophe rather than from intellectual synthesis. Before the Dust Bowl, American agricultural culture treated soil primarily as the substrate in which crops grew, an input to the farming process, effectively inexhaustible given the continent's scale, replaceable by moving to new ground when the current ground was depleted. The Dust Bowl demonstrated, at continental scale and in real time, that soil was not inexhaustible, that it could be destroyed within a generation through specific land use practices, and that its destruction had consequences that extended far beyond the property line of the person who had destroyed it. The dust from an Oklahoma farm field that settled on a ship deck in the Atlantic Ocean was the Oklahoma farmer's soil, and neither the farmer nor the Atlantic Ocean had consented to the transaction. This was the implicit argument of the Dust Bowl for a different understanding of the relationship between private land use and collective consequences, and it was an argument made not in words, but in the physical movement of the continent's topsoil across the sky. The specific experience of children who grew up in the Dust Bowl and later returned as adults to the southern Great Plains is preserved in oral histories and memoirs that describe a characteristic double vision. The place they had carried in memory through decades of absence, and the place they found when they returned. The memory was of the storms and the poverty, and the specific quality of fear that a 10-year-old feels when the sky turns black at noon and the adult in the room is moving quickly but quietly. The return was to a landscape that looked, to someone who had not seen it in 30 or 40 years, remarkably ordinary. Wheat fields and grass pastures and small towns with grain elevators. But that was legible to someone who knew what to look for as the recovered version of something that had nearly been destroyed. The windbreaks were there. The conservation terraces were there. The native grass waterways that interrupted the cultivated fields were there. The landscape had been designed since the 1930s around the knowledge of what happened when it was not managed correctly, and that knowledge was visible in every structural choice that had been made since then to someone who knew the history. The children of the Dust Bowl came back to a landscape that was shaped by what they had survived. It was not the same place. It was what the place had become because of what had happened to it. That is the most you can say about any landscape or any life. The water towers that stand above every Great Plains town are the most visible piece of the water infrastructure that makes permanent human settlement in a semi-arid landscape possible, and they have a relationship to the Dust Bowl that is not incidental. A town without water infrastructure cannot survive a drought. A town with a water tower and a well and a distribution system can maintain domestic water supply for its residents through dry years that would otherwise force abandonment. The water towers of the Southern Plains towns that survived the Dust Bowl were one of the physical reasons those towns survived. Not the only reason, not the primary reason, but a necessary condition in the specific sense that without reliable domestic water, the option of staying through a multi-year drought would not have been available. The people who built the water towers and the municipal wells in the years before the Dust Bowl, the small town governments that had taken on debt to install the infrastructure, the works projects that had extended the pipe networks to the edge of town, were not thinking about future droughts specifically. They were providing a service that people expected. The service they provided turned out to be load, bearing when the drought came, which is what infrastructure does when it is designed correctly. It holds up under the conditions it was not specifically designed for, because the people who built it understood that conditions would change. The hawks that hunt the Great Plains, the Swainson's hawks that migrate from Argentina every summer to breed in the grasslands, the ferruginous hawks that are the largest buteos in North America, and that nest in the remaining native grass pastures. The red-tailed hawks that are everywhere were reduced in the Dust Bowl years by the same mechanism that reduced everything that depended on the native grassland, the loss of the small mammals that form the base of their food chain. Prairie dogs were being poisoned, ground squirrels were starving, jackrabbits were being driven and clubbed in community hunts. The raptors that depended on these prey populations declined, and the decline was measured not by the people of the Southern Plains who had other concerns, but by the absence that the naturalists who returned to the region in the 1940s and 1950s documented by comparison with earlier survey records. The hawks came back when the prey came back. The prey came back when the grass came back. The grass came back when the cultivation stopped and the rain returned. The whole chain of dependencies, grass, burrowing animals, raptors, the balance of the grassland ecosystem, recovered partially and unevenly over the decades following the worst years, not completely, not identically, but enough that the hawks are there now, circling above the fields in summer, doing the work that hawks have always done on the Great Plains, hunting the animals that the grass supports, watching the wind move the wheat. The specific economics of tenant farming and sharecropping on the southern Great Plains shaped the Dust Bowl experience in ways that the owner-farmer narrative tends to obscure. A significant portion of the people farming the Southern Plains in the 1930s were not farming their own land. They were renting from absentee landlords or sharecropping, farming a landlord's land in exchange for a share of the crop, under arrangements that gave them limited rights to make decisions about how the land was managed and no equity stake in the land itself. A tenant farmer who understood that deep ploughing was destroying the soil had limited ability to change the practice on land he did not own, because changing the practice required the landlord's cooperation, and landlords who were not present on the land were often not attentive to the long-term soil conditions. The tenant farmer who left after a few bad years left with nothing. No land, no equity, just the crops that had not materialized, and the debt that remained from the credit he had extended to buy seed and fuel and food through the seasons when the crops had failed. The owner-farmer who left had at least the theoretical value of the land, however depleted, however mortgaged. The tenant left with the truck if he had one, and the family, and the specific skill set of a person who knew how to farm and had just run out of places to do it. The newspaper coverage of the Dust Bowl in the small-town papers of the Southern Plains, the Dalhart Texan, the Boise City News, the Liberal News, tells a story that is different from the national press coverage and different from the retrospective historical account, in a way that is instructive about how communities narrate their own disasters in real time. The local papers, which were commercial enterprises that depended on local advertising from local businesses and which were edited by people who lived in the communities they covered, were deeply reluctant to describe conditions in the most alarming terms, because alarming descriptions would accelerate the departure that was already occurring. The local papers reported on the storms, covered the relief programs, published the government bulletins, and ran the personal notices of families departing for California. But they did so within a consistent editorial frame of recoverable optimism, the next year country psychology expressed in print. The letters to the editors of these papers from the families who had left for California, describing the conditions they found there, and sometimes expressing regret, and sometimes expressing relief, were a form of correspondence that the remaining community read with close attention, and that the editors curated with the awareness that every letter was both information and a vote for or against the proposition that staying had been the right choice. The specific smell of the southern Great Plains after rain, after real rain, a soaking rain that reached the subsoil, not the light shower that evaporated before it made the ground wet, is something that survivors of the drought years described as the most intense sensory experience of the recovery, more specific and more immediately felt than any visual evidence of improvement. The smell of wet soil after a long drought has a chemical basis, a compound called geosmin, produced by soil bacteria that had been dormant through the dry years, and that activated rapidly in the presence of moisture, releasing a scent that human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to, capable of detecting at concentrations of a few parts per trillion. The sensitivity to the smell of rain on dry earth is a product of evolutionary history, a perceptual capacity that developed because detecting rain was valuable to organisms that depended on water for survival. The people of the southern Great Plains who smelled the first real rain of the recovery were experiencing a biological response to a meteorological event, a sensation encoded in the nervous system over millions of years of mammalian evolution, responding to the specific chemical evidence that water had returned to the soil. They called it the smell of rain. It was also, in the specific context of the Dust Bowl, the smell of the end of something. That was just the storms themselves. Wait until you hear about the specific communities that didn't leave. The towns in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, that recorded the highest storm frequency of the entire decade, where the county population dropped by 40%, and the ones who remained had a specific quality of stubbornness that doesn't translate into any other context. And what they found when they finally looked up from the shovels, and the dust had started, slowly and provisionally, to settle. The towns in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, that recorded the highest storm frequency of the entire decade, where the county population dropped by 40%, and the ones who remained had a specific quality of stubbornness that doesn't translate into any other context. And what they found when they finally looked up from the shovels, and the dust had started, slowly and provisionally, to settle.